Chapter 4. Grandma was thrilled when she heard about the children's quest. She said she would travel with them, and Ramada had no choice but to agree. Ramada suspected that Grandma wanted to keep a close eye on them. But even Ramada had to admit that Grandma's knowledge of the old ways might be a help. They decided to set out at dawn the next morning. When dawn rolled around, even the donkey seemed excited by the preparations for the journey. Maybe he sensed the hopeful spring in Ramada's step as she put on his harness and patted it carefully with folded rice sacks before she loaded up an empty barrel and a hose. Before they set off, Yusuf tied a metal rod onto a length of string. He held the string up high to line it up with Ali's sword. Then, he looked to see where it met the horizon. "There," he said, pointing. "We need to head for the second dune left of the baobab tree." There was only one container of water left in the village, but the elders insisted that the children take it with them. Ramada's mother handed Ramada the family's flashlight. "In case you end up traveling at night," she explained. The villagers wished them luck and waved, and the three explorers set off toward the shimmering sands of the Ghorma Desert. Ramada and Grandma sat on the cart, and Yusuf walked alongside. Before long, they were deep in the desert, and the village of Simbai was a distant speck on the western horizon. At midday, they reached the dune that Yusuf had pointed out. They led the donkey up to the ridge and looked around them for signs of water, animals, grass, or buzzing flies, but all they saw was sand. Grandma opened the container of water and passed it to Yusuf. "Drink well," she said. "If we limit ourselves to tiny sips, we'll soon get tired, and then we'll go crazy and die." Yusuf took a few big swigs and passed the container to Ramada. When the water was finished, Yusuf climbed up onto the cart, and Ramada took her turn walking. They trudged along the ridge of the dune, down the windward slope, and up another one. The stars had long disappeared, so instead, they used the sun to navigate, keeping their shadows over their left shoulders. "So what do you think the crooked hand is?" asked Yusuf. "It must be something you can drink from," said Grandma. "An oasis, maybe, or a river." "How will we know when we're close?" asked Yusuf. "Look out for birds flying in circles," Grandma said. "An oasis always attracts birds." As the afternoon wore on, a mountain loomed into view. "That," said Ramada, pointing, "is our last chance of finding water. From the top of the mountain, we'll be able to see for miles around. If there's an oasis anywhere nearby, we'll definitely spot it. And if there's not..." She trailed off into silence. The whole village was relying on them. Failure was not an option, and she knew it. Chapter 5. 2 hours later, thirsty and exhausted, the travelers arrived at the foot of the mountain. "You stay here, Grandma," said Ramada. "Make sure Donkey doesn't wander off. We'll climb the mountain and try to locate the crooked hand." The children made their way around to the east side of the mountain. It was much cooler in the shade, out of the sun's heat. They kicked their shoes off and began to climb. The east face was split down the middle by a deep crevice. Ramada squeezed into the crack and edged her way up. There were good handholds and footholds all the way up, so it was not hard to climb. Yusuf followed close behind, panting and muttering as he went. At last, they reached the mountain peak. They rested briefly, then stood up and looked around. Oh no, breathed Yusuf. This isn't good. They could see for many miles in every direction, but there was no sign of water at all. Nothing but dry dunes and dead trees for as far as the eye could see. Ramada stayed silent. She knew that if she tried to speak, she would cry, and she did not want to do that. She slumped back on the rock and stared, dry-eyed, at the cloudless, rainless sky. This desert journey, which had begun in such excitement, had come to nothing. And now, with their water container empty, how could they ever get back home to Simbai? As she lay there, a red-chested sunburn flew overhead, once, twice, and then a third time. It seemed to be circling. Ramada quickly sat upright. The bird gave her hope. "Look up, Yusuf!" she gasped. The sunbird circled a few more times, and then it landed on the mountaintop and looked at the children with interest. Down at the bottom of the mountain, Grandma was yelling what sounded like, "Fingers!" "What are you screeching about, Grandma?" shouted Yusuf. "I just walked around the mountain," Grandma shrieked back. "That crack you climbed up. There are 3 others like it. You see what this mountain looks like? 5 fingers pointing up to the sky." "I don't believe it," whispered Ramada. "Do you think the mountain could be the crooked hand?" The sunbird flew away from them and disappeared into a wide hole. Down it went, through layer upon layer of rock, and the children rushed after it, grazing their knees and elbows, but hardly caring. Ramada seized the family flashlight from her pocket and flicked it on, heart pounding in her chest. Desperate not to lose the bird, they moved quickly, skittering down through the mountain like rock lizards. Far down, the shaft widened, and the children tumbled out into what seemed to be a natural cave inside the mountain. To their left was a glorious circle of sunlight shining through an entrance to the cave. To their right stood the red-chested sunbird. The bird hopped up onto a narrow ledge and lowered its neck to drink. There, before them, was a natural spring. Clear, cool water emerging from the rock and cascading down into the belly of the mountain, as it had done for hundreds of years. They gazed, transfixed, while the sunbird drank, and then, with cries of joy, they flung themselves forward and gulped great mouthfuls of water from the flow. Chapter 6. It was late at night when the weary 3 arrived back home in Simbai. As soon as the thirsty villagers heard the rattle of donkey cart wheels, they jumped to their feet and ran to greet the travelers. "How did it go?" the villagers asked. "Did you find the crooked hand?" Grinning all over their faces, Ramada and Yusuf told their story. The villagers listened, enthralled, gasping at the difficulty of the journey, and finally, cheering in delight. "Once we found the spring, the rest was easy," Ramada concluded. "Yusuf fetched the hose, and we used it to channel the water down the side of the mountain. Grandma made sure that Donkey was standing in the right spot, and the water flowed straight into our barrel." The villagers drank their fill from the barrel, and then they started to dance and sing. The children felt themselves swept off the ground and hoisted onto their aunts' and uncles' shoulders. Somebody was even carrying Grandma, whirling her round and round delightedly. The village was saved, and it was time to celebrate. "We'll go back tomorrow and fill another barrel," Yusuf called to Ramada. "There's enough water there for everyone in Simbai." "Enough for Hundi, too," said Ramada. "They let us use their pump when water was short, so now we'll let them use our spring. The spring of the crooked hand." The spring of the crooked hand, sang the villagers,